The snowstorm came down like a curtain drawn across the world, swallowing track and sky alike, until the station stood like an island in a white sea. The whistle of the departing train had faded into the distance, its tail lights lost in the drift, leaving only the groan of the wooden platform and the hiss of the wind pressing against glass. Eleanor Whitfield stood where the train had left her, a trunk at her side, her hands red with cold, her hair loosed in strands of silver that clung to her wet cheeks. She was 50 years old, fat and slow, though once men had called her handsome. Now, in the eyes of those who watched from the depot windows, she was little more than an abandoned parcel, delivered, then forgotten. Her kin had promised to meet her. A cousin, a brother's son, someone of blood who had said, in ink, that she might come. But they were not here. She knew, even before the train's smoke vanished, that they had chosen absence over duty. Shame gathered in her chest like a stone, heavier than the trunk at her feet. She heard whispers inside the depot. Women murmuring about her age, about her girth, about the foolishness of a woman who still sought a place in this world. The storm made mockery of her. Snow clung to her skirts, melted down into her boots, chilled her ankles like iron shackles. Her breath steamed, broke, vanished. She felt herself dimming, like a candle guttering out where no one cared to relight it. The door opened. Elsie May, the widow who ran the station, peered out. "Best come in, Miss Whitfield," she said, though her voice carried neither warmth nor welcome. Behind her, Sheriff Amos Grady leaned against the stove, his hat low, his eyes sharp. Others gathered. Men with calloused hands, women with thin lips drawn tight against the cold and the sight of her. Their judgment weighed heavier than the storm. Eleanor shook her head, unwilling to step inside only to be pitted under their watchful eyes. She lifted her chin, though tears pricked hot at the corners. Pride was all she had left, and even that was fraying. She would not beg shelter, not here. If she was to freeze, then let the snow take her standing. The moment stretched, until the wind shifted, and with it came a figure from the blur of white. A shape, broad and tall, moving as though the storm bent to his stride. The door slammed behind Elsie May, the townsfolk retreating to the safer warmth of gossip, leaving Eleanor alone upon the platform. He emerged from the snow like a tail made flesh. Chenoa, the Apache. Shirtless despite the bitter cold, a buffalo hide slung across one shoulder, his chest carved by years of war and wilderness. His hair, black as raven wings, whipped about his face, and his eyes burned darkly under a ridge of bone that seemed carved for defiance. He walked with a certainty that belonged not to men, but to the land itself. Eleanor froze, fear darting through her like a startled animal. She had heard of him, every soul in town had. Savage, they said. Untamed. A man who answered insult with silence and insult repeated with steel. He did not look at the depot windows, though faces pressed against the glass. His gaze fell instead on her, and in that moment she felt as though the snow itself paused to listen. He stopped before her trunk, looked at her, then at the storm-worn lines of her face. She expected ridicule or dismissal, or perhaps the sharp cruelty men reserve for women they no longer deem beautiful. But his eyes carried none of that. They studied her as one might study a mountain, tall, immovable, waiting. "You're coming with me," he said, voice low, rough as stones in a riverbed. Her lips parted, breath stolen by the absurdity. No introduction, no question, only command. She wanted to protest, to ask why, but the words tangled with shame in her throat. She thought of the kin who had abandoned her, of the whispers inside the depot, of the storm that clawed at her bones. To stay was humiliation. To go was terror. Chenoa bent, lifted her trunk with one hand, as if it weighed no more than firewood. Then, without hesitation, he placed his other arm beneath her knees, and lifted her bodily from the snow. She gasped, clutched at his shoulder, felt the heat of his skin against her palm. The strength in him was undeniable, yet he carried her not as a prize nor as a burden, but as a man carries something he has already claimed. The door burst open behind them. Elsie May's voice cut sharp against the storm. "You can't just—" Sheriff Amos followed, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. "Put her down, Apache." Chenoa did not pause. He turned his head slightly, the snow catching in his lashes, and in his silence there was more threat than any weapon could bear. Amos stopped on the step, measuring the weight of a fight he would not win. Not here, not now. Elsie May hissed like a kettle, her words turning to frost in the wind. Eleanor, held tight against the giant's chest, felt herself torn in two. Humiliation burned, carried like helpless freight before the gossiping eyes of the town. Yet beneath it stirred something else, something she had thought long buried. The thrill of being chosen, of being seen, of mattering in a world that had told her she was finished. The storm swallowed them as Chenoa strode away from the depot. The white world closed in, and the last thing Eleanor saw before the snow veiled the station was the cluster of faces pressed to the glass, watching, whispering, judging. Her heart beat like a trapped bird. Where was he taking her? Why had he come? Questions knifed through the fog of her fear, but she could not speak them. His chest rose steady beneath her hand. His arm held her as if she weighed nothing. She had not been lifted like this since girlhood, and the shame of her body softened in that moment, replaced by the strange, terrifying grace of being carried at all. The snow thickened, erasing the tracks of their passage. Wind roared in her ears, yet inside she heard only the thrum of his heartbeat. For the first time in years, she was not standing alone in the storm. When the station lights finally vanished, leaving only darkness and the shriek of the wind, she realized the truth that chilled her deeper than the snow. She had been claimed before she could consent, carried into a fate she had not chosen. And yet, against all reason, her fingers tightened on his shoulder, unwilling to let go. The storm did not relent, but Chenoa walked as though it bowed beneath him. Eleanor clung to his shoulder, her breath shuddering against the hollow of his throat, her skirts stiff with ice. The world was a blur of white, a wilderness stripped of color, where the only certainty was the rhythm of his stride. At last, through the flurries, a cabin rose, rough-hewn logs darkened by snow, smoke bending from a crooked chimney, the shape of survival carved against the endless storm. He set her down at the threshold, not unkindly but without ceremony, and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The warmth that spilled out struck her like a blow. Wood smoke, pine resin, the faint sweetness of drying sage. She staggered inside, half blinded, her numb hands reaching for the wall. The cabin was small, a single room stretched long with a loft above. A fire glowed in the hearth, shadows dancing across shelves stacked with hides, tools, bundles of herbs and weapons hung with care. It was a place built for one man, yet it seemed to wait for another presence. Chenoa followed, shutting the storm outside with a slam. The sudden quiet unnerved her. Only the crackle of the fire and the settling sigh of timber filled the room. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, ashamed of the water dripping from her dress onto the floor. He dropped her trunk near the wall, and without a word crossed to the hearth. His great hands added logs to the fire until it flared, sending light and heat outward. From a shelf he pulled a folded quilt, its stitching uneven but careful, and set it across her shoulders. She looked up at him, startled. But he had already turned away, crouching to strip snow from his boots. Eleanor sat on a stool, clutching the quilt. It smelled faintly of smoke and earth, as if it had known winters longer than she had. She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant by bringing her here, yet words faltered. Her tongue felt clumsy in a mouth too used to silence. He moved with purpose, striking flint, adjusting iron, pulling down a kettle to rest above the flames. He worked as though she had always been there, as though no explanation was needed. She watched, torn between gratitude and fear, her shame gnawing like a rat inside her chest. What must he see when he looked at her? A cast-off woman, fat and gray, shivering like a beggar at his hearth. Her hands, raw from the cold, trembled as she reached for the quilt to cover her knees. The fabric slipped, and for a moment she thought he would not notice. But he did. Without lifting his eyes, he shifted a second blanket from the bench and laid it within her reach. It was not pity. It was a gesture as plain as adding wood to the fire. And somehow that plainness pierced her more deeply than kindness ever had. He spoke at last, his voice low, deliberate. "You were alone." She startled, the sound of his words filling the cabin as if they had been carved into the logs themselves. She searched for reply, fumbling, ashamed of the truth. My kin, they did not come." Chenoa nodded once, not with surprise but with certainty, as though he had already known. He poured steaming water into a tin cup, dropped in dried leaves, and held it out. She took it, her fingers brushing his for an instant, and warmth spread through her chest faster than the tea itself. Silence returned. Yet it was not the silence of rejection or of scorn. It was a silence that breathed, that allowed space for firelight and shadows, for thought and unspoken things. Eleanor sipped the tea, her gaze drifting around the cabin. Everywhere she saw signs of solitude. A bedroll folded with soldierly precision, a hunting bough polished by long use, herbs strung in rows like prayers. Yet here and there lingered details that unsettled her. A second chair by the table, a shelf cleared as though waiting. She wondered if he had lived all this time preparing, in some quiet way, for a presence beyond his own. The storm rattled the shutters, and she flinched. He glanced toward the window, then back to her, his expression unreadable. She felt suddenly like a trespasser, a burden upon his space. Her voice broke the stillness, edged with apology. "You shouldn't have brought me. The town will talk. They always do." For the first time, his gaze locked with hers fully, steady as stone. "Let them talk." The words were simple, but they landed in her chest like a torch. She turned away quickly, her throat tightening. No man had ever spoken on her behalf so directly, not without strings, not without cruelty behind it. Tears pricked her eyes, though she forced them back, unwilling to weep before him. He rose, crossed to the door, and lifted the bar against the storm. She watched the breadth of his back, the way the fire's glow sculpted his shoulders, the scars etched across his skin. He was a man built by struggle, and yet his silence carried a strange gentleness. As night deepened, he set bread and dried meat upon the table. He did not serve her. He simply placed it there and went back to the fire, leaving choice to her. Hunger won over pride, and she ate slowly, ashamed at how greedily her body received each bite. He did not stare. He did not measure her with scorn. He whittled instead, shaping a block of wood into something she could not yet name. When her hands stilled, she looked at him again. His head was bent, dark hair falling across his brow, the blade flashing in rhythm with his breath. The sound of the storm seemed farther away. A thought came to her unbidden, dangerous. Perhaps she was not merely an object rescued for pity. Perhaps, in some unfathomable way, she was wanted. But then doubt surged. What future could there be for a woman of her years, her shape, her shame? What madness had carried her here? The wind howled, and the cabin shivered. Chenoa looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. The carving in his hand was taking form, something small, delicate, yet deliberate. He set it aside on the table, closer to her, though he said nothing of it. Eleanor's breath caught. The figure was of a bird, wings outstretched, its lines rough but full of life, as though poised to lift from the wood itself. Her heart lurched, unsteady. She reached for it, then stopped, afraid to claim what was not yet hers. The storm battered the cabin walls, but inside the silence thickened, intimate and unbroken. She felt the weight of change pressing in, heavier than snow, stranger than fear. When she finally dared to lift her eyes to his again, she saw not command nor judgment, but a gaze steady as the mountain, waiting, unhurried. And in that gaze she sensed the tremor of her own heart, that nothing in her life would ever be the same. By morning, the storm had gentled into a steady hush, snow blanketing the pines and fields so deeply it seemed the world itself had been buried. Eleanor rose from the pallet Chenoa had made for her near the hearth, her bones stiff, her body heavy, yet her spirit troubled more by the knowledge of what must now be stirring in town. She could almost hear their voices, Elsie May's sharp tongue, Sheriff Amos's gruff certainty, the whispering women with their sly glances. They would say she had been taken, that she had given herself in shame, that no good woman of her years should lie beneath the roof of an Apache. Chenoa was already outside, his form a silhouette against the snow as he split logs with strokes so sure the wood seemed to fall apart willingly. She watched through the window, quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and for the first time in many years she felt the odd tug of safety. The storm had not broken him. Nothing, it seemed, could. But what of her? Could she withstand the eyes of the world? By noon, a rider came. The sound of hooves carried faint but sure through the snow-silenced air. Eleanor's heart seized, dread filling her throat. She knew before she saw him who it would be: Amos Grady, the sheriff, riding with his hat pulled low and his jaw set hard. She shrank back from the window as the horse slowed near the cabin. Chenoa did not flinch. He stood tall with axe in hand, waiting. Amos reined in, the snow crunching beneath hooves, and his eyes flicked toward the window where Eleanor's pale face had betrayed itself. He called out, voice cold. "That woman don't belong here, Chenoa." The Apache said nothing. His silence was heavier than iron, sharper than any drawn blade. Amos shifted in his saddle, restless. "Folks are talkin'. A woman her age, taken by you, it won't stand." Still, no answer. The sheriff's hand twitched toward the butt of his gun, though he did not draw. He muttered something low, then turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, leaving his threat like frost in the air. Eleanor pressed trembling fingers to her lips. Her shame had not stayed buried in the storm. It had followed, riding swift on gossip and judgment, and soon it would choke her. She turned from the window only to find Chenoa standing inside, axe resting against the wall, snow melting from his hair. He said nothing of the sheriff, only bent to stir the fire, the flames rising as if in defiance of the world outside. Later, as dusk deepened and shadows crawled across the walls, Eleanor sat at the table, brushing out her white hair. Each stroke of the comb felt like an act of exposure. Her hair had once been her beauty. Now it was the mark of age, the thing whispered about most often in cruelty. She half expected him to look away, to scorn what time had made of her. Instead, she felt his gaze, quiet, unwavering. She glanced up, startled, and saw no ridicule there. He reached for something on the shelf and set it before her. A wooden comb, newly carved, the figure of the bird still etched in its spine. She stared at it, breath caught, fingers trembling as she lifted it from the table. "I cannot," she began, but her voice broke, her throat filling with the ache of long-buried sorrow. "They mock me. For this." She lifted a strand of her hair, white as the snow outside, and let it fall. "They say I am finished." Chenoa's answer was not in words. He placed his hand flat on the table, the veins of his wrist strong, his palm steady. His eyes met hers, calm and unyielding. "Here," he said, voice low, carrying weight. "You stay." Her breath shivered. For years she had been cast aside, shifted from one kin to another like a parcel too heavy to keep. Now this man, who owed her nothing, who spoke so rarely, claimed her presence as if it were the most natural truth in the world. She pressed her hand atop his, only for a heartbeat, but in that brief touch the fire between them burned brighter than the hearth. It was then that the door creaked open, timid and small. A boy stepped inside, snow in his hair, cheeks flushed from the cold. Tommy Lee, the stable boy. He carried a bundle in his arms, bread wrapped in cloth, his eyes darting nervously between them. "Brought this," he whispered. "Folks don't know. They'd say I shouldn't. But I seen the way he looks at you, Mississippi." Eleanor's cheeks warmed with sudden heat. Chenoa took the bread, nodding once, and the boy slipped out as quietly as he had come. Silence held again, but it was changed. Eleanor felt it inside her, the shift from shame toward something she dared not name. She set the wooden comb beside her own old one, and for the first time in years she let her hair fall loose entirely, shining in the firelight like snow under the moon. Night fell deeper, the storm beyond the walls easing into whispers. She sat by the fire, her quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and Chenoa across from her, the flames painting his face in bronze and shadow. He whittled another piece of wood, his movements patient, deliberate, while she watched, the rhythm soothing the storm inside her heart. At last she spoke, her voice hushed, the firelight catching tears she could not hold back. "I thought myself alone in the world. Too old to be seen. Too heavy to be held. Too foolish to be wanted." Chenoa lifted his gaze. His silence pressed against her words like a hand stilling a wound. "Not alone," he said. Her breath caught, her heart breaking open. She turned away quickly, for the tears fell fast, and she would not shame herself before him. Yet even as she wept quietly into the quilt, she felt his presence steady across the fire, an anchor against the storm. The flames dwindled low, the cabin wrapped in flickering shadows. She closed her eyes, exhaustion heavy, but her heart too full to rest. When she opened them again, he was still watching, his whittling set aside. The fire cast his face in light, his gaze unflinching, and in that gaze she felt both fear and wonder. Her lips parted, but no words came. Only the truth, undeniable, thundered in her chest, that this silence between them was no longer emptiness, but the beginning of something that might yet change her life. And as the fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney, she realized that the world outside, the gossip, the judgment, the shame, would not rest. It would come for her, and soon. Yet tonight, here by the firelight, she no longer belonged to their whispers. The storm returned at nightfall, fiercer than before, a wall of white roaring against the cabin, as though the sky itself had split open. Eleanor sat close to the fire, her quilt pulled around her, watching the shutters tremble under each gust. The sound was relentless, a howl that made the logs groan and the chimney moan. Yet inside, the hearth burned steady, and Chenoa moved through the cabin with a calmness that unsettled her. He laid fresh furs upon the floor, arranged bundles of sage, and set a strip of red cloth across the table. She did not ask what he was doing at first, though her heart quickened with each movement. His silence had weight, like a river before flood, and she knew enough of him by now to understand that his actions spoke where words would not. But when he took down a carved bowl filled with cedar sprigs and began to burn them, their smoke curling into the rafters with a sweetness that clung to her hair, she could no longer hold back. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice smaller than she intended, swallowed by the storm. He looked at her, eyes dark and steady. "Union." Her breath caught, the word lodging in her chest like a stone dropped into water. Union. Marriage. She gripped the quilt tighter, her heart hammering. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. 50 years old, her body worn, her hair long past the pride of youth, and here stood a man of 31, strong as a mountain, unbent by shame. "You cannot mean," she began, but her words failed under the heat of his gaze. Chenoa lifted the strip of red cloth, running it once between his hands, then laid it across his palm. "Apache way," he said simply. "No preacher. No lawman. Wind is the witness." Eleanor's throat closed. She imagined the faces in town, the sneers, the mocking laughter, Elsie May's shrill tongue calling her desperate, Amos's cold judgment declaring it scandal. She had been cast aside all her life for being too much or too little. To join herself to him now would be to stand against every voice that had ever told her she was unworthy. "I am too old," she said, her voice trembling, almost pleading. "I am not what a wife should be." He stepped closer, the storm's fury behind him, the firelight upon his scarred chest. "You are here," he answered, quiet but certain. He extended the cloth toward her, his hand steady. Her eyes blurred with tears. She shook her head, but inside, her heart swelled with a longing so deep it frightened her. To be chosen, not in pity but in resolve, to be seen, not as a burden but as a companion, was more than she had ever dared imagine. She thought of her kin, their empty promises. She thought of the town's laughter. And she thought of this man, who asked nothing but her presence. Her hands trembled as she set aside the quilt and rose. The cold rushed in from the floorboards, but she stepped toward him anyway, her bare feet silent on the planks. He lifted her wrist, bound it gently with one end of the cloth, then bound his own. Their hands were joined, red between them like a vein of fire. Eleanor could not breathe. The weight of the storm, the fire's glow, the silence of the cabin, all of it pressed down until she felt she might break. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and unbidden, falling onto the cloth. Chenoa did not wipe them away. He only nodded once, solemn, as though her tears themselves were part of the vow. He spoke in his language then, words low and flowing, rough with sounds she could not understand but felt in her bones. The cadence was steady, carrying the rise and fall of something ancient. She listened, her heart aching, and though she did not know the meaning, she knew the intent. Promise, endurance, belonging. When he finished, the cabin fell silent but for the wind's shriek. She waited, unsure what to do, but he gave her no instruction. Instead, he looked at her as though the choice were hers alone. Her voice quavered when she spoke, barely more than a breath. "Yes." The word seemed to break something inside her, not in despair but in release. Years of rejection, years of shame, years of hiding behind silence, all of it poured out in that single syllable. The storm outside howled louder, as if the world itself bore witness. Chenoa's eyes did not soften, but they deepened, and she knew then that she had been received. He pressed his forehead to hers, the cloth pulling their wrists close, and in that stillness the fire seemed to flare higher. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his breath, the strength of his presence, and for the first time in her life she was not diminished by love but magnified. They stood that way for long moments, the storm raging and the fire crackling, until he stepped back and loosed the cloth. He folded it carefully, laid it back on the table, and returned to the hearth. His movements were plain, unembellished, but everything in the cabin had shifted. Eleanor sat down slowly, her knees weak. She touched her wrist where the cloth had been, feeling the phantom heat of it still burning into her skin. Married. Bound. Not by law, not by preacher, but by the will of one man and the acceptance of her heart. Doubt stabbed at her. How could she face the world outside this cabin? What cruelty would the town heap upon her when they learned? Yet when she looked across the fire at him, whittling again with calm assurance, she felt a strange courage begin to grow. Perhaps the world's scorn mattered less than the steadiness of this man's silence. The storm raged long into the night. She lay awake, listening, her heart restless, her body trembling with fear and wonder both. When she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of red cloth stretching across snow, unbroken, a thread that tethered her to something vast and unyielding. At dawn, the storm broke. Sunlight poured through the cracks in the shutters, striking the floor in pale bars. Eleanor rose, her breath unsteady, and pushed the window open. The world outside was a wasteland of white, dazzling and endless. And there, carved into the snow leading away from the cabin, were tracks, boot prints and hoof prints, evidence that someone had come. Her blood chilled. She turned back to Chenoa, who was already strapping his knife to his hip, his face unreadable. "They know," he said. The words struck her harder than the wind ever could. The town, the gossip, the judgment, it was no longer distant. It was coming. The sun thawed the storm into a blinding white glare, each drift shining like glass under the cold sky. Eleanor walked beside Chenoa down the path that wound from the cabin to the valley, her boots sinking deep into snow. The red cloth of their joining still burned in her memory, but now her chest knotted with dread. The town would have heard by now. Every face would be waiting, sharpened by judgment. She clutched the quilt about her shoulders, though warmth came more from his steady presence than from wool. They reached the station by midday, where the townsfolk had gathered in a knot of restless bodies, voices buzzing like hornets. Elsie May stood near the steps, arms folded, mouth ready with venom. Sheriff Amos leaned against a post, hat-brim shadowing eyes already narrowed. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, pointing with whispers. All eyes turned as the Apache, and the old woman walked out of the white silence into the square. "Look at her," Elsie May hissed, voice carrying. "Shameless, to bind herself to a savage." Eleanor's throat burned. The shame was a tide threatening to drown her, yet she felt Chenoa's hand brush hers, not gripping but steadying, and it anchored her against the swell. Amos straightened. "Eleanor Whitfield," he called, his tone heavy with law though laced with scorn. "This union's no binding here. Folks won't accept it." His gaze flicked to Chenoa. "Best you let her go back where she belongs." The words struck harder than the wind. Where she belongs. Eleanor felt her heart cave, years of rejection piling one atop another. Yet as her head bowed, she caught the sight of Tommy Lee at the edge of the crowd, his small face pale but his eyes defiant. The boy shook his head almost imperceptibly, urging her not to yield. Her hands trembled, but her voice found its way through the cracks. "I did not belong when my kin cast me aside," she said, her tone quivering but loud enough to be heard. "I did not belong when your whispers made me a fool for aging. I did not belong anywhere." She lifted her chin then, silver hair whipping in the wind, and her gaze met theirs with a courage she had never known. "Until he claimed me. And I chose him." A murmur rippled through the crowd, half laughter, half unease. Amos's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're saying, Eleanor," You're led astray. Chenoa stepped forward, silent but immense, the axe slung across his back like a warning carved from iron. His eyes never left the sheriff, and in that gaze was promise enough. Amos's hand twitched at his holster but stilled. Even he knew better than to test silence that deep. Elsie May spat at the snow. You're a disgrace, woman. Old as you are, flaunting yourself like some. The words cut, but Eleanor did not flinch. For the first time in her life she did not shrink under insult. Her voice rose, steady now, carried by something larger than pride. I am no disgrace. I am a wife. His wife. She reached for Chenoa's arm then, not to cling but to stand. The simple act of touching him before them all, without shame, was louder than any denunciation. The crowd shifted, discomfort threading through their ranks. Some lowered their eyes, others muttered. But no one moved forward. The storm that had raged all week seemed to stir again in the silence, the wind curling through the square like breath drawn before a strike. A man near the back shouted, "Drive him out!" Another echoed, "Send the Apache back to the hills." Amos looked from the crowd to Chenoa, then back to Eleanor. "This won't stand," he warned. Chenoa's voice broke the air then, low and resonant, like distant thunder rolling over mountains. "It stands." The hush that followed was heavier than the storm. Eleanor's heart pounded, yet instead of fear there bloomed a fierce pride. She straightened, her shoulders no longer bowed by shame. She turned so all could see her face, pale and lined, hair gleaming white in the sunlight like a crown. "I will not be cast aside again," she said. "If you think me unworthy, so be it. But I am no longer yours to scorn." For a long breath, no one moved. Then Tommy Lee's voice, small but piercing, cut the silence. "Leave 'em be. They belong more than we do." The boy's cry cracked something in the air. Men who had shouted now looked away, uncertain. Women tightened arms around their children. The storm's bite whistled down the street, but no one dared step closer. Amos's jaw clenched, yet he did not draw. Elsie May's lips thinned into silence. Eleanor stood in that square with Chenoa's presence towering beside her, and for the first time in her 50 years she felt tall. Not beautiful in the way they counted beauty, not young, not thin, but radiant with the fire of dignity. She had survived shame, survived abandonment, survived the storm itself, and now she stood unbroken. Chenoa lifted his axe from his back and drove it into the frozen ground beside him, the sound ringing like a bell. The crowd flinched, but he did not raise it again. It was not a threat, it was a mark. A line drawn. A vow carved into earth. No one crossed it. Slowly, one by one, the townsfolk drifted away, muttering but subdued. The square emptied until only Amos remained, hat low, eyes narrow. He studied Eleanor long, then turned his horse without a word, the crunch of hooves fading into distance. Silence wrapped the square, broken only by the wind. Eleanor's chest heaved, tears sliding hot down her cheeks, but she did not bow her head. Chenoa reached for her then, not pulling her close, only setting his hand upon her shoulder, heavy and sure. She placed her hand atop his, her fingers steady now. Together they turned from the station, from the judgment left behind, and began the walk back into the wilderness where the storm had once carried her away. As they stepped into the drift, Eleanor glanced back only once. The axe still stood upright in the snow, gleaming in the pale sun, a marker of their defiance and their belonging. She knew the whispers would never end, that tongues would still cut behind closed doors. But she also knew this: she had chosen and she had been chosen. That truth could not be taken. Her voice, soft but certain, rose against the wind. "Let them talk." Chenoa looked down at her, the corner of his mouth curving, almost a smile. The storm shifted, the sun breaking free of a cloud, light spilling across the snow like a benediction. Eleanor felt it then, not shame, not fear, but a fierce, trembling joy. For the first time, she belonged.